On a crisp autumn morning in 2019, the bustling studio of Morning Talk America was preparing for what would become one of the most memorable episodes in daytime television history. The show's veteran host, Richard Martinez, known for his sharp questions and controversial interview style, adjusted his blue tie while reviewing his notes. Today's guest was none other than the legendary Snoop Dogg. The studio buzzed with excitement as makeup artists and production assistants scurried around, making last-minute preparations. Snoop Dogg had arrived early, dressed in a sleek black suit paired with his signature gold chains. His calm demeanor and friendly interactions with the crew members stood in stark contrast to what was about to unfold. Behind the scenes, Martinez was working with his production team, fine-tuning questions that would later prove to be his biggest professional mistake. The host had spent days researching Snoop's past, particularly focusing on controversial aspects of his life that most interviewers respectfully avoided. As the clock struck 9 a.m., the studio audience filed in, filling every seat. Many had traveled from far corners of the country just to see Snoop Dogg in person. The energy in the room was electric, with fans whispering excitedly among themselves, some wearing merchandise from Snoop's latest clothing line. The show's producer, Sarah Chen, approached Snoop in his dressing room for the final pre-show briefing. "We'll start with questions about your new album, then move on to your recent charity work," she explained, unaware that Martinez had his own agenda. Snoop nodded, taking a sip from his morning tea, his eyes reflecting years of media experience. The first segment of the show went smoothly. Martinez interviewed a local chef about healthy eating habits, followed by a brief weather update. The tension in the studio began to build as Snoop's segment drew closer. The commercial break before his appearance seemed to stretch on forever. When the cameras finally rolled again, Martinez introduced Snoop with his usual flair. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a man who needs no introduction. The one, the only, Snoop Dogg." The audience erupted in applause as Snoop walked onto the set, his signature swagger evident in every step. The initial exchanges were pleasant enough. They discussed Snoop's latest musical projects, his recent collaboration with young artists, and his growing business empire. The audience laughed at Snoop's witty responses and casual jokes. Everything seemed to be going perfectly according to plan. However, observant viewers noticed Martinez's subtle shift in body language as the interview progressed. His shoulders tensed, and his smile became more forced. The production team, watching from their control room, began to sense something was off. Even the camera operators exchanged worried glances. 15 minutes into the interview, Martinez suddenly changed his tone. His friendly demeanor disappeared, replaced by an aggressive stance that caught everyone off guard. The studio temperature seemed to drop several degrees as he shuffled his papers, preparing to launch into his carefully planned attack. The audience could feel the shift in atmosphere. Some began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. A young production assistant whispered to her colleague, "This wasn't in the script." Sarah Chen, watching from the sidelines, reached for her headset, ready to intervene if necessary. But Snoop remained unfazed. Years of dealing with the media had taught him to read people well, and he had sensed Martinez's underlying intentions from the moment he stepped on set. He sat back comfortably in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, his face maintaining its cool expression. As Martinez prepared to ask his first controversial question, the tension in the studio reached its peak. The audience held their breath, social media managers had their fingers ready to tweet, and millions of viewers at home leaned closer to their television screens, unaware that they were about to witness one of the most remarkable moments in talk show history. The stage was set for what would become a viral sensation, a masterclass in handling provocative journalism, and a moment that would change the landscape of celebrity interviews forever. But for now, Snoop Dogg simply waited, his years of experience and wisdom about to shine through in a way that would leave America speechless. To be continued in Part 2. The tension in the studio reached its breaking point as Richard Martinez leaned forward in his chair, his face taking on an almost predatory expression. The teleprompter had gone dark. This was completely off script. With a cold smile, he launched into his attack. "Mr. Dogg," Martinez began, deliberately using the formal address to sound condescending, "you've managed to fool a lot of people with this cleaned-up image, haven't you? Let's talk about your real past." The audience gasped collectively, and several producers backstage began speaking rapidly into their headsets. Martinez pulled out a folder, dramatically spreading several old newspaper clippings across the glass coffee table between them. The headlines, dating back to the early 1990s, highlighted some of the darkest moments from Snoop's past. The host's voice grew louder, more accusatory with each word. Gang affiliations, legal troubles, promoting violence through music. How do you justify this to the parents who are now letting their kids listen to your music? Martinez's voice dripped with judgment. The camera caught Sarah Chen, the show's producer, making frantic cutting motions from the sidelines. The studio audience sat in uncomfortable silence. A young woman in the front row covered her mouth in shock. Two security guards near the stage entrance shifted their positions, uncertain about how this situation might escalate. But Snoop Dogg's reaction surprised everyone. Instead of showing anger or defensiveness, a slight smile played across his face. He took off his designer sunglasses slowly, carefully folding them and placing them in his jacket pocket. The simple action commanded attention, and the studio fell even quieter. Behind the scenes, chaos erupted. The show's director was shouting into his headset, "Get ready to cut to commercial. Someone get Martinez under control." But before anyone could act, Snoop raised his hand slightly, signaling he wanted to respond. The cameras caught something remarkable in that moment. While Martinez sat there, red-faced and aggressive, Snoop's posture remained relaxed. His eyes, however, held a depth of wisdom that made the host's attack seem suddenly childish and unprofessional. "You know what's interesting?" Snoop began, his voice calm and measured. "You had to dig back almost 30 years to find those headlines." He picked up one of the yellowed newspaper clippings, examining it with genuine interest. "That young man you're talking about, he grew up in Long Beach, California, during one of the toughest times in the city's history." The studio was absolutely silent now. Even Martinez seemed caught off guard by Snoop's composed response. The rapper continued, his voice taking on a storyteller's rhythm that had everyone leaning forward to listen. "See, what you're trying to do here is paint a picture of someone who hasn't changed, who hasn't grown. But let me tell you something about change." Snoop paused, making eye contact with various audience members. "Change isn't just about leaving your past behind. It's about learning from it, understanding it, and using those lessons to help others avoid the same struggles." Martinez attempted to interrupt, but Snoop held up his hand again, this time with more authority. "You've brought up parents and their kids. Let me tell you what I tell those kids when I visit schools and community centers, which I do regularly, though those headlines didn't make it into your folder." The audience began to murmur in approval. A few people even started clapping, though they quickly quieted down to hear more. The cameras panned across faces showing increasing support for Snoop and growing disapproval of Martinez's tactics. "I tell them my story, all of it, because that's how you create real change. You don't hide from your past. You use it as a testimony to show others that transformation is possible." Snoop's voice carried throughout the studio, his words resonating with an authenticity that no amount of prepared questions could challenge. Martinez's face had lost its aggressive edge, replaced by a look of growing uncertainty. He shuffled his papers nervously, realizing his attempted ambush was backfiring spectacularly. The folder of damaging headlines now seemed like a cheap prop in the face of Snoop's genuine wisdom. The segment was supposed to last another 10 minutes, but in just these few moments, the dynamic had shifted completely. What was meant to be an expose had turned into something entirely different. A masterclass in grace under pressure and the power of personal growth. As Snoop prepared to continue his response, social media was already exploding with clips of the exchange. What happened next would not only change the course of the interview, it would become a defining moment in both men's careers. To be continued in Part 3, the next few moments in the studio created what many would later call the longest silence in daytime television history. After Snoop's initial response, he deliberately paused, creating a space of tension that made everyone in the room hold their breath. Martinez, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, nervously shuffled through his papers. The sound seemed unusually loud in the quiet studio. Sweat had begun to form on his forehead, and a makeup artist stepped forward with a powder puff, but he waved her away with an irritated gesture. Snoop Dogg sat back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Martinez's face. The rapper's calm demeanor had an almost hypnotic effect on the audience. He took a slow sip from his water glass, the ice cubes clinking against the sides in the silence. The simple action somehow made Martinez appear even more uncomfortable. From the control room, frantic discussions were taking place. The show's director, Tom Phillips, was watching multiple monitors while speaking rapidly into his headset. Do we cut to commercial? Stay on Snoop? Get a reaction shot from the audience? But something told him to let this moment play out naturally. The studio audience remained frozen in their seats. A young woman in the third row was recording everything on her phone, her hands shaking slightly with excitement. An elderly gentleman in the front row nodded slowly, as if appreciating the masterclass in handling conflict that was unfolding before him. Sarah Chen, the producer, had moved closer to the stage. She could see Martinez's legs shaking under the desk, a nervous tic she'd never noticed before in her 5 years of working with him. The host opened his mouth twice to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched for exactly 47 seconds, an eternity in television time. During this period, the cameras captured something remarkable. While Martinez grew increasingly agitated, Snoop's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes held a mixture of wisdom and what almost looked like pity for the host. Finally, Snoop leaned forward slightly in his chair. The simple movement caused Martinez to flinch visibly. The rapper's voice, when he spoke again, was even softer than before, but somehow it carried even more weight. You know what's interesting about silence? Snoop asked, though it was clearly a rhetorical question. It gives people time to think, to reflect, to really consider their choices. He gestured toward the scattered newspaper clippings on the table, like the choices you made in preparing for this interview. The audience murmured in agreement. Behind the scenes, social media managers were reporting unprecedented engagement levels. Hashtag Snoop Silence was already trending nationwide, with clips of the quiet standoff being shared thousands of times per minute. Martinez attempted to regain control of the situation. Well, I think our viewers deserve to know the truth, he stammered, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The papers in his hands were now visibly shaking. Snoop's response was immediate but measured. Truth? He smiled slightly. Let's talk about truth. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The action was so unexpected that Martinez physically leaned back in his chair. The camera zoomed in as Snoop pulled up a series of photos on his phone. They showed him at various community centers, schools, and youth programs. This is from last week, he said, showing a picture of himself reading to children at a local library. And this one? That's from the day before you dug up those old headlines. The contrast between Martinez's prepared attack and Snoop's real-life examples of community service was stark. Several audience members were nodding vigorously now, and someone in the back started to clap before quickly stopping themselves. As this moment drew to a close, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening. This wasn't just a celebrity defending himself against a hostile interviewer. It was a demonstration of how silence, when used properly, could be more powerful than any words. The tension in the studio had transformed into something else entirely. There was now an anticipation in the air, a sense that they were all witnessing something historic. The next few minutes would prove them right, as Snoop prepared to deliver a response that would be quoted in journalism schools for years to come. To be continued in Part 4. What happened next would become one of the most viral moments in talk show history. Snoop Dogg, still maintaining his composed demeanor, stood up from his chair, something that rarely happens during television interviews. The move caused Martinez to push his own chair back slightly, clearly unsure of what was about to happen. Let me tell you a story, Snoop began, his voice carrying a warmth that contradicted the tension in the room. Not the story you wanted to tell today, but the real story. He walked around the coffee table, past the scattered newspaper clippings, and faced both the host and the audience. The security guards tensed, but Snoop's body language remained entirely non-threatening. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. Not a script, but what appeared to be a child's drawing. The camera zoomed in to reveal a crayon artwork showing Snoop surrounded by smiling kids. This right here. He held up the drawing. I got this yesterday at the Long Beach Youth Center. A little girl named Maria drew it. Her brother was heading down the same path I once walked, but now he's in college, studying to become a teacher. Martinez's face had lost all color. His prepared ambush was being transformed into something entirely different. The camera caught his producer, Sarah Chen, wiping away tears as Snoop continued speaking. You came here today thinking you'd expose something about me, Snoop said, his voice growing stronger but never angry. But let me tell you what really needs exposure. Let's talk about how the media would rather focus on someone's past than their growth. Let's discuss why it's easier to tear someone down than to acknowledge their transformation. The audience burst into spontaneous applause, but Snoop raised his hand for quiet. He wasn't finished. Walking back to his seat, he picked up one of Martinez's newspaper clippings. This headline right here, from 1993, that young man was me. I own that. But let me show you something else. He pulled out his phone again, this time bringing up a recent news article about his youth football league, which had helped hundreds of kids stay off the streets. This is also me. This is who I became. Not because I was trying to fool anyone, as you suggested, but because every human being has the capacity to grow, to learn, to become better. He looked directly at Martinez. Even hosts who try to ambush their guests. The studio erupted in gasps and quiet murmurs. Martinez's face flushed red, but before he could respond, Snoop continued, his voice taking on an almost teacherly tone. You see, what you're doing right now, this right here. He gestured at the scattered papers. This isn't journalism. This is entertainment at the expense of growth. You're telling kids out there that their past mistakes will always define them, no matter how much they change. Someone in the audience shouted, "Preach," and others began nodding vigorously. The cameras panned across faces, showing a mixture of emotion and admiration. But I'm going to do something different, Snoop continued. Instead of getting angry, instead of walking out, I'm going to use this moment to demonstrate what real growth looks like. He turned to face Martinez directly. I forgive you, brother. Not just for this attempt to ambush me, but for not doing your full research. For not telling the whole story, because that's what growth is about. Understanding that everyone, including you, deserves a chance to learn and do better. The studio fell completely silent again, but this time it was different. It was a silence of respect, of understanding, of witnessing something profound. Even the camera operators were visibly moved. Martinez, who had interviewed presidents and world leaders, found himself speechless. His papers lay forgotten on the table, his prepared questions suddenly seeming small and petty in the face of such wisdom. As this portion of the interview drew to a close, social media was exploding. The hashtags #SnoopTeaches and #GrowthOverGossip were trending worldwide. What had been planned as a takedown had instead become a powerful lesson in forgiveness, growth, and the importance of telling the whole story. The next segment would prove even more powerful, as Snoop prepared to turn this moment into a broader discussion about media responsibility and the power of personal transformation. To be continued in Part 5. The atmosphere in the studio had completely transformed. What started as a hostile interview had evolved into something far more meaningful. Snoop Dogg, now fully in control of the narrative, decided to shift the conversation in an unexpected direction. Let me tell you about what I saw last week, Snoop began, pulling out his phone once again. I visited 5 different community centers in Long Beach. He turned the screen toward Martinez, showing photos of smiling teenagers in a classroom setting. These kids aren't looking at my past, they're looking at their future. Martinez, still visibly shaken from the previous exchange, tried to regain some composure. But surely you understand why people might be skeptical. He started, but Snoop cut him off with a gentle wave of his hand. Let's talk about skepticism, Snoop said, standing up again. Let's talk about why media focuses on tearing people down instead of building them up. He walked to the edge of the stage, addressing the audience directly. How many of you have ever made a mistake you regret? Nearly every hand in the audience went up. The cameras panned across the sea of raised hands, creating a powerful visual moment. Even Martinez, almost unconsciously, raised his hand slightly. Now, how many of you would want that mistake to define you forever? Snoop asked. Every hand went down. The point was clear, and the audience began applauding spontaneously. Sarah Chen, the producer, was frantically signaling to her team. This wasn't just good television anymore. It was becoming a cultural moment. Social media managers reported that clips were being shared millions of times, with celebrities and influential figures beginning to weigh in. You came here today with old news, Snoop continued, returning to his seat. But let me give you some real news. Yesterday, we launched a new program in inner-city schools. We're providing music education, coding classes, and entrepreneurship training to kids who might otherwise never get these opportunities. The camera caught Martinez's expression changing from embarrassment to genuine interest. His prepared attack questions lay forgotten on the table as he leaned forward, actually engaging with the conversation for the first time. "Tell me more about that program," Martinez said, his voice notably softer than before. It was the first authentic moment he'd shown during the interview. Snoop smiled, recognizing the shift. "See, now that's good journalism. Asking about things that matter." He pulled out another piece of paper, this time a formal document. "This is the program outline. We're starting in 10 schools next month. By the end of the year, we'll be in 50. The audience members were furiously taking notes on their phones, many already looking up how they could get involved with these initiatives. The show's social media team reported that the program's website had crashed from sudden traffic. "But here's what's really important," Snoop continued, his voice taking on an educator's tone. "These kids need to see that change is possible. They need to know that their past doesn't define their future. And that's why what you tried to do today, that's more harmful than you realize." Martinez nodded slowly, the realization of his mistake clearly visible on his face. I may have approached this wrong," he admitted, in a rare moment of on-air vulnerability. "No may about it, brother," Snoop replied, but his tone was friendly rather than accusatory. "But you know what? This is your moment to show growth too. Right here, right now." The studio lights seemed to brighten as Snoop pulled his chair closer to Martinez's desk. The hostile interview was transforming into a masterclass on redemption and second chances. "So let's talk about what really matters," Snoop said, spreading out materials about his youth programs. "Let's show people how to turn negative energy into positive change, because that's what real growth looks like." The production team was scrambling to adjust their runtime, knowing they had something special happening. The planned segments for the rest of the show were being rapidly reworked to accommodate this unexpected turn of events. As they headed toward a commercial break, the energy in the studio was electric with anticipation. What had started as an attempt to expose Snoop's past had become a powerful demonstration of how to transform confrontation into conversation, conflict into collaboration. The next segment would prove even more transformative, as Snoop prepared to turn this moment into something nobody in the studio would ever forget. To be continued in Part 6. When the show returned from commercial break, the studio atmosphere had transformed completely. The audience, initially quiet and tense, was now fully engaged in what had become an impromptu masterclass in personal growth and media responsibility. A young woman in the front row stood up, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Snoop," she called out, her voice trembling. "My brother is in prison right now, and everyone gave up on him, but hearing you today," she paused, gathering her courage. "Can I share your story with him?" Snoop turned to face her, his expression softening. "What's your brother's name?" he asked. The cameras captured this intimate moment as the woman replied, "Marcus." "Marcus," Snoop repeated, addressing the camera directly. "I don't know you, but I know your story. And let me tell you something, your story ain't over yet." The audience erupted in applause, with several people wiping away tears. Meanwhile, social media was exploding. The show's digital team reported that #SnoopTeacheslove and #SecondChances were trending worldwide. Clips of the interview were being shared by celebrities, politicians, and educational institutions. Martinez, who had started the show as an aggressor, now sat quietly, watching his guest connect with the audience in a way he'd never seen before. His producer, Sarah Chen, was frantically motioning to the camera operators to capture every moment. A distinguished-looking man in a suit stood up next. "I'm the principal of Long Beach High School," he announced. "What we're seeing here today, this is what our kids need to see. Not the gossip, not the scandal, but the transformation." Snoop nodded appreciatively. "Education over entertainment, right?" he responded, causing another wave of applause to sweep through the studio. The show's social media feeds were flooded with comments. People were sharing their own stories of transformation, inspired by what they were witnessing. The #hashtag my transformation story started trending, with thousands sharing their journeys of personal growth. A young production assistant rushed onto the set with a tablet, showing it to Sarah Chen. Celebrity reactions were pouring in. Famous musicians, actors, and public figures were all sharing the interview clips, adding their own messages about growth and change. Martinez, finding his voice again, but this time with humility, addressed Snoop. "I've been doing this show for 15 years, he admitted, but I've never seen anything like this. I came here to create drama, and you turned it into something meaningful." The audience's reaction to this confession was immediate. What started as scattered applause built into a standing ovation. People were hugging each other, some crying, others nodding in understanding. Security guards at the studio entrance reported that a crowd had gathered outside, having heard about what was happening through social media. Many were young people, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had just delivered such a powerful message about change. A teenager in the audience raised his hand. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice cracking. "People tell me I'll never amount to anything. But watching you today..." He couldn't finish his sentence, overwhelmed with emotion. Snoop stood up and walked over to the young man. The security team tensed, but Snoop simply placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your past is a lesson, not a life sentence," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The cameras captured this moment perfectly, creating what would become one of the most shared images of the year. The studio audience, normally well-behaved and contained, began sharing their own stories spontaneously. What had started as a regular talk show segment had evolved into something resembling a community gathering or healing circle. Martinez's planned schedule for the show was completely abandoned. His producers, recognizing the significance of what was unfolding, let the moment continue organically. The raw authenticity was creating television magic. As this segment drew to a close, it was clear that something unprecedented had occurred. What was meant to be a scandalous expose had transformed into a powerful demonstration of growth, forgiveness, and the possibility of change. The media aftermath would prove even more remarkable, as news outlets across the country prepared to cover what had become much more than just another celebrity interview. To be continued in Part 7. Within hours of the show's airing, every major news network was running segments about what they called the interview that changed television. The studio's phones were ringing nonstop as reporters, producers, and media personalities all sought to understand how a planned ambush had transformed into such a powerful moment of cultural significance. CNN's headline scrolled across their ticker. "Snoop Dogg turns hostile interview into lesson on growth and redemption." Fox News, despite their usually critical stance, ran with "Rapper shows America the true meaning of grace under pressure." Even international media outlets picked up the story, with BBC News featuring an extended analysis of the interview's impact. Sarah Chen, the show's producer, found herself being interviewed by multiple networks. "We produced over 1,000 episodes," she explained to a reporter from Entertainment Weekly, "but nothing prepared us for what happened today. The phones haven't stopped ringing." Social media platforms were overwhelmed with activity. Twitter reported that clips from the interview had been viewed over 50 million times in just 3 hours. Instagram was flooded with memes and quotes from Snoop's responses, particularly his line about "your past is a lesson, not a life sentence." The young woman whose brother was in prison, identified as Maria Rodriguez, became an overnight sensation. Morning shows were competing to book her as a guest, wanting to hear more about her reaction to the powerful moment she helped create. Educational institutions took notice too. Harvard School of Journalism announced they would be using the interview as a case study in their media ethics class. The dean released a statement saying, "This is a masterclass in how to handle media confrontation with dignity and purpose." Martinez's reputation underwent a dramatic shift. While some criticized his initial approach, many praised his ability to show humility and growth during the interview itself. His Twitter followers doubled overnight, with many commending his willingness to learn and change in real time. Behind the scenes, the show's staff was dealing with unprecedented attention. The young production assistant who had captured the crowd gathering outside the studio on her phone had her video picked up by major news outlets. The clip showed hundreds of people, many of them young, holding signs with quotes from the interview. Celebrity reactions continued to pour in. Major artists and actors shared their own stories of transformation, creating a ripple effect across social media. #MyTransformationStory remained trending for days, with millions of people sharing their personal journeys of change and growth. The community centers and youth programs mentioned by Snoop during the interview were flooded with volunteers and donations. The website for his youth football league crashed multiple times due to excessive traffic, as people rushed to support his initiatives. Media analysts began dissecting every moment of the interview. They noted how Snoop's body language, tone, and word choice had completely diffused the hostile situation. Body language experts were brought in to explain how his calm demeanor had transformed the entire dynamic of the conversation. Professional journalists started using the interview as an example of what not to do in terms of ambush journalism, while simultaneously praising it as a demonstration of how to handle such situations with grace. Journalism schools reported a surge in discussion about media ethics and responsibility. The studio received countless letters and emails from viewers sharing how the interview had impacted them. One particularly moving message came from a prison warden who had shown the clip to inmates, reporting that it had sparked deep discussions about personal transformation. Martinez's show saw its ratings skyrocket, but not for the reasons originally intended. Viewers were tuning in to see if the host's apparent transformation was genuine. The show's format began to shift, focusing more on redemption stories and personal growth rather than confrontational interviews. A week after the interview, several major networks aired special programs analyzing its impact. Media historians compared it to other iconic television moments, with many suggesting this would be remembered as a turning point in how celebrity interviews are conducted. As the dust began to settle, it became clear that what had happened in that studio was more than just good television. It was a cultural moment that had sparked a national conversation about growth, redemption, and the power of second chances. The story wasn't over yet, though. The lasting impact of this interview would continue to ripple through society in ways that nobody could have predicted. To be continued in Part 8. 1 year after the historic interview, its effects were still being felt across American culture. The moment had transcended its origins as a television segment and had become a cornerstone of discussions about media responsibility, personal growth, and societal transformation. Martinez's morning show had undergone a complete renovation. Gone were the ambush-style interviews and gotcha moments. Instead, the show now featured segments called Growth Stories, where guests shared their journeys of personal transformation. The ratings had never been higher, and the show won several awards for its new direction. Media training programs across the country developed new modules based on the interview. The Martinez moment, as it became known in journalism circles, was used to teach reporters about the difference between confrontation and meaningful dialogue. Television hosts began approaching controversial topics with more nuance and respect. The show's producer, Sarah Chen, published a best-selling book titled The Day Television Changed, chronicling the behind-the-scenes story of the interview. She revealed that the original segment was supposed to last only 15 minutes, but ended up running for the entire hour as they recognized its significance. Social media platforms reported that the interview had created lasting changes in online behavior. The hashtag Transformation Tuesday took on new meaning, with people sharing stories of personal growth rather than just physical transformations. Cyberbullying rates showed a measurable decrease in the months following the interview. Educational institutions incorporated the interview into their curricula. High school teachers reported using it in classes ranging from media studies to social ethics. Students wrote essays analyzing the power dynamics, communication strategies, and conflict resolution techniques displayed in those crucial moments. The security guards who had been present that day started their own podcast, Watching History Happen, where they shared their perspectives on witnessing the interview firsthand. Their insights into how tension can be diffused through calm dialogue gained them an unexpected following. Community centers across America reported a surge in volunteer applications, with many citing the interview as their inspiration. Snoop's youth programs expanded to 50 states, creating opportunities for thousands of young people to learn music, technology, and entrepreneurship skills. Martinez himself had undergone a profound transformation. He toured the country giving talks about his experience, openly discussing how being on the receiving end of such grace had changed his approach to journalism. His catchphrase became "Listen to learn, not to respond." The interview's influence reached beyond media and entertainment. Corporate training programs began using it to teach conflict resolution. Political consultants studied it for lessons in handling hostile situations. Even international diplomats referenced it when discussing the power of transformative dialogue. One of the most significant developments was the creation of the Second Chance Media Initiative, a foundation started by Snoop and Martinez together. The organization worked to promote responsible journalism while providing opportunities for young people interested in media careers. The studio where it all happened became something of a landmark. Tours would stop by, and guides would point out the exact spot where Snoop stood up to deliver his memorable responses. The chair he sat in was preserved and later donated to the Smithsonian's Museum of American History. As the first anniversary of the interview approached, a documentary titled The Power of Pause was released, examining how those few minutes of television had created lasting change in American media culture. It featured interviews with everyone present that day, from the camera operators to the audience members. The legend of the interview continued to grow, but its real legacy was in the countless small transformations it inspired in newsrooms, classrooms, and living rooms across America. What began as an attempt to create controversy had instead created community, turning a moment of potential conflict into a lasting lesson about the power of growth, forgiveness, and the possibility of change. The story served as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful messages come not from carefully planned segments, but from authentic moments of human connection. In the end, what happened that day wasn't just about Snoop Dogg or Richard Martinez. It was about the potential for transformation that exists in every interaction, every conversation, and every moment of choice. The end.